Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from Down. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we welcome back the one and only Peter Levenda to talk about, you guessed it, Lovecraft. In particular, we focus on one of Peter's books from a few years back, The Dark Lord, which I've referenced multiple times on the blog and is even quoted in Starships, as well as Peter's looming next book, which is also his first novel, The Lovecraft Code. Onwards then. Mr. Levenda, welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me back.
Oh no, I've been looking forward to this one. We ran out of time in the first podcast, and I desperately wanted to talk to you about Lovecraft. So, question one, Peter. When did you first encounter Lovecraft, and what was it about his work that sort of enticed you or hooked you straight away?
Well, I was never a fan of Gothic horror. I was never a fan of horror fiction in general. I think the closest I came maybe to reading that sort of thing was Dennis Wheatley. Those 3 or 4 novels he did, which were based on his, contacts with Aleister Crowley and the OTO and the Golden Dawn, The Devil Rides Out, The Devil a Daughter, The Satanist. Those are the 3 that stand out.
You didn't use Dark Forces?
I didn't like that they used them?
No, you didn't like the book they used Dark Forces? I just reread that at the beginning of the year is all.
Oh no, I didn't. Don't even know about that one.
Oh yeah, that's his. Actually, it's quite up your alley in a way. That's him. That's his World War II story where both sides are using dark forces. So,
okay,
that's one to pick up.
Well, then it is. I wasn't aware of it. He has quite a large published oeuvre, I should say. It's like a lot of different books, but those are the 3 that really came to my attention back in the 70s.
Gotcha.
So, I was a kid, and I was not much of a kid in the 70s anymore, but I was 20 years old or so when I came across, I think I was younger. I think I was a teenager when I came across Wheatley. And so Wheatley said it for me because Wheatley wrote seemingly with a kind of an inside look at it. His depictions of the orders in England and how they operated and all of that seemed really, it was sort of romantic and, dramatic, but it still was very interesting to me. So I read that. I had read The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury and October Country and that sort of thing. So I had that, reading background where that was concerned, but most of my reading was completely different. And Lovecraft was not a name I knew anything about until the 1970s when this whole Necronomicon thing happened. And I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't know anything about Lovecraft, and no one had mentioned Lovecraft to me in a sentence, so I didn't know what that was all about. And then eventually I gradually became aware of Lovecraft. Still didn't care much for the style at the time. Didn't really relate to it very well. It was years before I really started to take a different, closer look at Lovecraft, try to understand what that was, what it was all about, what the attraction was. And I came across a different sort of perspective on Lovecraft. Part of it possibly due to Kenneth Grant and his Typhonian trilogies, which are heavily influenced by his reading of Lovecraft. And he was taking it quite seriously. Here was someone whose intellect was certainly, of a pretty high caliber. And I thought to myself, well, maybe I better take a look at this again and see what this is all about. And I went back to Lovecraft and I did a deeper study of it, beginning with the Typhonian trilogies. I guess we're talking late 1970s at this point, early 1980s. And I started to read that, and I started to develop a kind of an appreciation, not just for Lovecraft, but for Kenneth Grant's handling of the Lovecraft material from a different point of view, going on the assumption that Lovecraft was somehow channeling something real, or was in touch with something real, in a sense that it wasn't just pure fantasy or pure invention, but that he was driven to write about what he was writing about. And as I'm struggling with all of that, and I'm in the midst of studying, Western occultism, the serious stuff, and reading about the OTO and the Golden Dawn and that whole Western tradition from that end, reading the stuff by Randolph and all the other stuff, and a kind of a familiarity with Blavatsky and all of that, something jumped out at me. and that was reading The Call of Cthulhu for the third or fourth or fifth time, I don't know. Really looking at it from the point of view of deconstructing it. And realizing that something that Lovecraft does in his stories, which I've not really come across anywhere else, and that is that Lovecraft is extremely specific about dates and places in his writing. He will say, on this particular month, day, and year, this is what happened in this place. And that to me was striking. And I thought to myself, what is it? What is he trying to tell us? Why is he that specific? Most people are using the fictional narrative as poetic license to write whatever they want to and not be fixed or held down by a timeline. But Lovecraft seemed to want to be held down by a timeline. Time was very important to Lovecraft, eras and ages, as we know from his writings, and this general idea of ancient times and things beyond written history, recorded history. But then he's writing about the 20th century, and he says, well, and this happened in 1907. Specifically on Halloween, October 31st in 1907, there was this ritual in Louisiana, and it involved this statue of this sort of humanoid figure with kind of a fish, but it had tentacles and all the rest of it. And I'm reading this thing, and I'm saying, well, why? What is it about, 1907 specifically? Why is he writing about 1907? What does that have to do with anything? And so as I'm looking at that, I'm making notes. As I usually do, I'm making notes in notebooks about things that I'm trying to follow up. And then I realized that, Aleister Crowley's holy books, as they're called, were written on precisely that day, from about October 30th, 31st, November 1st of 1907. He was writing in a white heat, all of these scriptural texts, if you will. And if you read them, in isolation, just read those books and then compare them with Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu. You'll be shocked at the kind of similarity of language and even similarity of symbology. And it was overwhelming. I was looking at this and I'm thinking, whoa, wait a minute. What does this mean? Lovecraft for sure had no knowledge of the holy books of Crowley. I could bet anything on that. I mean, he was kind of aware of Crowley's existence, but I don't think he was sitting there reading thalamic literature.
Well, they didn't exactly. No one did. They didn't exactly fly off the shelves. Crowley's self-published, enormous library of books. Sure.
And it would not have fallen into Lovecraft's hands. I mean, he was sort of penniless, and when he wrote Call of Cthulhu, he was living in Brooklyn, in this apartment that was robbed, while he was living there, and he has a horrible time of it, and kind of broke, and then goes back to Providence, and the rest is history. But I thought to myself, Crowley was actually writing about a fish-headed god with tentacles, and I mean, who thinks of that? How is that somehow self-evident in the mythology of the world? Why would two writers come upon the same concept and connect it to the same precise date? Now, I'm not saying that Lovecraft was sitting there channeling Cthulhu, or some sort of weird entity, but I do think that Crowley and Lovecraft both were expressing something that was much deeper, something that was much more potent for both of them. And they both saw the same thing, but from different angles.
And funny enough, the key to unlock that is in the Call of Cthulhu itself, where it opens with the idea that, you have artists and poets around the world sharing a similar ominous dream.
Precisely. And that's precisely the angle. That was the way in for me to this entire field. I started to look at it completely differently and started to say to myself, wait a minute, there's something else. Kenneth Grant is right somehow. He didn't pick up on this, oddly enough. Grant never wrote about 1907 and the relationship between the Crowley works that were written at that time and Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu, which I found bizarre when I finally realized it. He'd never mentioned this. In all the 9 books that I've gone through, he never once mentions this peculiar similarity. And yet there it is. And I'm thinking, well, Grant then understood something as well. He just couldn't put his finger on it either. So that led me to really rereading the Typhonian trilogies with a view towards deconstructing them and trying to find out, can I use Lovecraft to understand Crowley, let's say, can I use Crowley to understand Lovecraft? Can I use them both as windows onto each other and develop a kind of a third, kind of perspective on this? And that's, what happened. That's how the Dark Lord came about. I realized a number of things. One was that the Lovecraft-Crowley connection was deeper, or on some deeper level than we imagined, perhaps. I also realized that a lot of people who write about Thelema and Crowley and the OTO kind of ignored the influence of the Golden Dawn. They give it lip service. The Golden Dawn was, formative. I mean, Crowley was a member of the Golden Dawn and all of this, but they don't really deconstruct Crowley's writings from the Golden Dawn perspective, from the rituals that he went through as an initiate of the Golden Dawn. Because the Book of the Law is full of Golden Dawn references. And most of his writing, Magic and Theory and Practice and all the others, they're replete with references to the Golden Dawn. And you can't possibly understand what he's writing unless you understand those rituals, you've made a study of them, and the terminology and the mythology behind it. So I started to fold that into the study. And then, of course, I had to fold in the one blind spot that Crowley had, which was the works of the Obeah and Wanga, the Afro-Caribbean ritual material that he kind of sidestepped in all of that. So I had to fold that in. Michael Berthiaud, of course, did a lot of work on that. He was trying to fill that empty spot. And then
Crowley
finally,
called them out as a blind spot as well. Like he said, these words are important and there's something to do with this.
Right.
On to the next bit,
Yeah, right. I have no idea what it is.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, and I think Berthiaud did a great job. Kenneth Grant did a great job in trying to open and unpack all of that. But then there was also Tantra. Now, that was Kenneth Grant's probably most famous contribution to this entire study, was the idea of, actually linking Tantric practices and Tantric scriptures to Crowley's work and to try to create a ritual structure that included all of that. And the sad thing is that, and this happened to me, it happened, I think, to everybody I knew back in the 70s and 80s who were reading Grant. It's, just what the hell is he talking about? And that's true for most of his work. I mean, he's indecipherable, Grant, for the most part. You really have to be very patient and sit down and try to read him slowly and identify those things that you don't know what he's talking about. But when he starts talking about the kalas, for instance, this is a very important theme, and Grant mentions it numerous times throughout his work, that there are these strange, mysterious essences that the female body exudes, at certain times of the month and everything else. And it's very vague. But he talks, in this sort of tantalizing way of magicians using little metal plates to collect these essences and then use them to great, magical effect. And we're all sitting there saying to ourselves, what the hell is he talking about? What is this? And there was nothing, there is no literature on this. So I said, okay, one of the things I have to do is explain Kenneth Grant's Tantric references. And I had made a study of Tantra for years, wrote a couple of books on Tantra. And now I thought, okay, I'll go back and do this too. So in Dark Lord, one thing I do that I hope any reader would find valuable is that I actually list the 16 kalas and I give them their Sanskrit names and what they're supposed to be, involved with, what goddesses are connected and all the rest of it, which is at least a way into that system that didn't exist before. So if you're reading Kenneth Grant and you come across the Sanskrit stuff and you're at sea, the idea behind the Dark Lord was, okay, you've got some place of Vade Mikum that you could go and try to find out just what he's talking about and put it in some kind of perspective. So it was quite an ambitious undertaking to write the Dark Lord because I had to deal with Lovecraft first and foremost. I had to kind of explain Crowley and the idea of the aeons and all of that stuff as well. I had to talk about Afro-Caribbean magic and Tantra and on and on and on. And at the same time, keep talking about Kenneth Grant and why Kenneth Grant was important. So Lovecraft for me is of a piece with all of this.
And that sort of analysis is sort of an example of what we talked about last time with Sinister Forces. The fact that I agree, Grant could kind of feel there was something to it rather than, get the precision of it. That kind of mouthfeel that there's an authenticity behind the things Lovecraft was talking about. And
Sure.
He got his history as wrong as, Crowley did about, thinking Sumeri is the oldest and all that. But it's because he's trying to find that sense of, ancient reality and so on behind it. And I think the Tantra pieces allow someone to kind of go, okay, well, that indicates that there may well be phenomena behind this that kind of, in a very Lovecraftian way, runs tangential or horizontal to a cultural timeline. It seems like different cultures bumping up against similar phenomena.
Right. I mean, in the end, we're all talking about the same thing, and we may have a different perspective on it. But the darkness that's at the heart of reality, what we perceive to be the darkness, is the same everywhere, and we come to terms with it in a different way. In Tantra, you approach it in a specific way. In Afro-Caribbean religions and spiritual movements, it's a different way. And in the pure African, it's different yet again. And of course, Western occultism, with its preoccupation with Satanism, for instance, is another aspect of this. And Lovecraft was writing about all of it. Lovecraft, of course, had it's in his writings, a visceral distaste and fear of other races, And we look at it now from an enlightened point of view and say, my God, the guy was a racist and an ethnophobe. But at the same time, it was really giving form to something that was deeper than that. It wasn't about race, and it wasn't about ethnicity. It was about something other. It was about some kind of weird darkness. Lovecraft,
he was racist even for the time. Like when people say, "Oh, that's just how people thought back then." Yeah, they did, but like Lovecraft decided to go a little bit further. He was racist even for his time.
Oh yeah, he was impossible even for his time, And I absolutely agree. I think it's because he conflated some of the things he was feeling about the elder gods, about Cthulhu, about all of the various beings that he was coming up with. He was conflating that with race. He was trying to find something in the material world around him to hang that on to. And in Call of Cthulhu, it's obvious. I mean, the only actual rituals that are taking place in Louisiana among people who are not white. He sort of made that connection in his head. And it's a wrong-headed connection, but I can see that he's grasping towards something. And he's making the assumption that people who are not coming from a purely Western European background, or at least not a WASP background, are in touch with, demons, with devils, with weird gods, with ancient rituals and different religions. And then if he just had gone one step further, which he kind of did, those rituals were an expression of something even darker than that, something that pre-existed the religions that these people are involved with and the cults that they're worshiping. So I think that he was reaching for that. He just didn't do, that good a job of it. He was sort of in the throes of it. And in a novel that's coming out shortly called The Lovecraft Code, my first published novel, I bring back the idea. I want people to think about the fact that Lovecraft, as a boy and as a young man, was growing up in a house where both of his parents went insane. And that's something that's not really focused on very much, even by the scholars and the academics. His father went insane, possibly as a result of syphilis. His father was a traveling salesman. He evidently went a little off his rocker at some point and went to the hospital in Providence and died there. And then his mother developed all sorts of psychoses. She would wander around the house and screaming about things that she saw or things that were coming after her. She had a kind of paranoid schizophrenia happening. I don't know what the technical or clinical definition would have been at that time in the 1920s. But Lovecraft is growing up with firsthand experience of insanity. And to someone with Lovecraft's scientific background, his love of science, his professed atheism, to have to deal with insanity, I think was a major challenge to his worldview as well. And by dealing with insanity on a daily basis, by listening to his mother go insane, by all the weird stuff she would say, and she would wander around the streets sometimes, he would have to go and find her and bring her back. This would have had a tremendous effect on his own psyche. It might have opened him up to other things. It might have made him more vulnerable. And then his atheism and his scientific attitude was his reaction against it, trying to build a wall against these feelings and these ideas that were coming to him. And I think he was a tortured individual for that reason, like many artists are, especially those who are sensitive and channeling these dark forces.
There's also, I think you're right. I actually think there's a lot about Lovecraft as a human that beyond his racism that I don't think people. I think there are other shoes to drop about his life. I think that's a very good one. And when you mention whether if an experience like that growing up would open him up to something, you can also clearly see how he would associate spiritual belief with insanity and also terror, but at the same time the experience is very similar to the sort of, you know, a Cold War depatterning where you're kind of messing with someone's head by having the stability of their kind of near social structure crumble around them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting sort of circle. You go, Lovecraft could only have been built by those experiences.
I believe so. You know, and I can feel for him. I mean, I've known people growing up under the same circumstances. I know what they go through. You know, you witness this in other people, and you see that this is the path they're suddenly going down. A person who grows up with direct experience of insanity in a family member or a close friend will then eventually start changing their perspectives on the world in general. They become different. They become defensive sometimes, or they become wary. They're easily frightened, because, you know, there's erratic behavior, you know, things that don't make sense, illogical behavior. And once you have to deal with illogical behavior on a regular basis, it becomes kind of logical. You know, it has to take on a kind of patterning of its own that you become sensitive to that other people are not. And I can see that in Lovecraft, this is what would have been taking place. And his fiction was his release. He was trying to exorcise those demons, almost literally. He was trying to get them out. And what came out was some of the best, horror fiction. I mean, he's the father of Gothic horror for that reason. And so I think that's what connected him on some level to what Crowley was literally going through on precisely the days that Lovecraft is writing about. I mean, there's Crowley in 1907 going, a little bit off his rocker. I mean, Crowley himself admitted that the holy books almost wrote themselves. He didn't know what they were even about as he was writing them. He just wrote them in a kind of a white heat. And the language, as I show in The Dark Lord, I compare passages between Lovecraft, the Call of Cthulhu in particular, and the holy books. And when you compare them, I mean, it's like it's the same writer who's written them. It's the same style. It's eerie. And then in the holy books, we have the first time that Crowley talks about a creature he calls Cthulhu, without knowing what that means. And we have Cthulhu, the way I pronounce it anyway, Cthulhu in the Lovecraft stories, and we have Cthulhu in the holy books, again, Halloween 1907. So it's one thing to have a similarity in style and a similarity in subject matter, but when you throw a word in that's bizarre and yet is resonating with the other word, then you have to ask yourself, is there something deeper at work here? And I've written in Sinister Forces about these kinds of things that happen, that turn up, and this is like another iteration of the same idea, the same phenomenon.
It is, and I mean I think the evidence is open and shut that he never read Crowley. Again, not that many people did. But so, who were some of Lovecraft's inspirations? We'll start with the real ones, and then I want to talk about, we might call them inferred inspirations, that we're kind of in an absence of evidence situation, but there are alignments there. I mean, do we know if he read Jack London?
I believe he did. I think he made a reference at one point in one of his stories to something out of London.
Yeah, because there are, if you widen out, say, an Ancient Aliens perspective of what Ancient Aliens is, as we use that word as shorthand, obviously.
Right.
There was books, fiction, and, say, theosophical stuff that was happening in the late 19th century that starts to have... we can kind of imply, especially if they're, in his long night walks and wandering around New York where some of these groups were operating, it seems perfectly reasonable to suggest, he certainly wouldn't have believed it or been a theosophist, but it certainly seems reasonable to suggest that this idea of beings from, say, Sirius interacting with mankind through history and that kind of stuff, and Jack London's still excellent red one, would have been part of the stuff that kind of mixed in with his general, horror and attempt to map the world. I mean, do we know, other than, say, Jack London, I mean, what do you think to the idea that he read some Bailey or read some Blavatsky?
Oh, I think he was familiar enough with Blavatsky. I mean, he mentions Theosophy in Call of Cthulhu. He uses the small t version, but I think he was extremely, conscious of the fact that Theosophy, the Theosophical Society, existed, that Blavatsky existed. I mean, the way he talks about these groups shows a kind of familiarity with them that I think is due to the fact that he was very well aware of the Theosophical Society and the writings of Blavatsky. He had to have been. I'm not sure about Bailey, but I'm kind of sure he would have been familiar with Blavatsky. I think beyond doubt. Especially in New York for the 2 years that he spent there.
Exactly.
The Theosophical Society was very active. There was a branch of the Golden Dawn that was active in New York City at that time as well. I don't think they were very upfront about it, but he probably could have heard something about it. He had a kind of a wide circle of literary friends, some of whom would have been knowledgeable about this as well. So I think these were influences, and of course Freemasonry was an influence. I mean, he had relatives who were Freemasons. They had I think his grandfather had an excellent library, some of which, odds and ends of which he inherited, but most of which got sold when he died. So Lovecraft was bereft. I mean, he read Richard Burton, 1001 Tale, Arabian Nights. So he was familiar with the Arabian Nights stuff as well, which in the Burton translation is actually quite deep and very very extensive, as far as talking about Islamic contexts for all sorts of mysterious stuff. But I think that Lovecraft was also probably quite familiar with Seabrook, with William Seabrook, if only because Lovecraft seemed to be quite familiar with the Yazidi. And Yazidi in those days was almost only known through the writings of William Seabrook, who was a friend of Aleister Crowley, by the way. And Seabrook had written about the Yazidi as devil worshippers, and wrote about the 7 towers of Satan or something stretching across from Iraq all the way out into Manchuria somewhere. So there was this idea that there was a group called the Yazidis in the Middle East who were worshipping the devil. And other writers had written about it before Seabrook, but Seabrook kind of popularized it in the 1920s. And it's possible that Lovecraft would have been influenced by that as well. And what I find astonishing is that, Yazidi is kind of this term that Crowley used a couple of times too. Mentioned Yazidis only a few times in the context of devil worshipping. And Lovecraft did the same. I mean, the horror at Red Hook and some of the other stories he wrote have references to Yazidis. And what I find astonishing is that we're talking about Yazidis all the time now. If we're following what's going on in Iraq with the Islamic State and with all the rest of it, the Yazidis are, right in front of this because of the attacks on Mosul and on Mount Shinjar and all the rest of it. There's this, a huge amount of information coming out about the genocide that's being operated against the Yazidis. So we're actually talking about them now for the first time on a kind of global stage, whereas for the last 100 years or so, they've only been whispered about as, they're devil worshippers. And of course, they're not exactly devil worshippers, but that's another story.
Well, exactly, yeah. I think the Seabrook stuff was more widely read than people realized. That there was those 7 towers didn't exist and so on, but
sure.
You had that kind of there was, incorrectly or not, a sort of cultural awareness that there's this devil worshipping group in the exotic Middle East.
Right.
It came back funnily enough, in New York as well. It came back in Crowley's life when he met someone with the name Iwaz, who told him that Iwaz is the devil that the Yazidis worship, and that's a survival of a Sumerian god, and so on. So we kind of come back to that weird intersection of place and word and name and Crowley and Lovecraft, separated by several decades at this point, that kind of returns to a Sinister Forces analysis where you go, there is something weaving in and out of this that we can really only glimpse, which is a very Lovecraftian thing to say.
It is, and it's something that I started to relate to very strongly in the last 10 years or so, as I started to toy with this idea of writing in fiction what I find impossible to write in nonfiction, because there are too many constraints in nonfiction. And I really wanted to tell a story that was based more upon the gut reactions to this material than it was a dry recitation of facts. And the whole Yazidi material is fascinating. I mean, their symbol, the one that you'll see everywhere, a symbol of the Yazidi ethnicity, is a kind of seal with a peacock in the center, because the peacock angel Melek Taus is their connection to the Godhead, is their god. But next to it is writing in cuneiform, you know. And if you talk to the Yazidi, if you I've seen interviews with Yazidi leaders, they deliberately connect themselves to Sumer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is something they actually do. It's not that we've projected it onto them, or maybe we did and they adopted it. I mean, at this point it's almost impossible to tell. But they connect themselves with Sumer. There were no peacocks in Iraq. Peacocks come from India. So that was suggestive in and of itself. Why would an ancient clan living in this remote region worship a peacock and claim that their god is a peacock angel? How did that come about? So the peacock is there, the cuneiform writing is there, the deliberate connection back to Sumer is there, and the fact that they have two scriptures, one of which is called the Black Book. All of this, and of course the idea about Satan, the Satan being the first fallen angel and therefore the first one to be welcomed back into heaven, and the Yazidis who believe that they are the ancient people, the original people on the planet. They will follow the peacock angel. They will follow Satan exactly back into heaven. They'll be the first ones to go. The rest of the human race will have to catch up. I mean, all of these ideas that you hear so often, badly informed, misinformed, sometimes disinformed or whatever, all of these things are part of the mythos around the Yazidi. And then the reality is the genocide that's taking place.
No, absolutely. In Starships, there's sort of an extra layer where, whilst there were no peacocks in Iraq or Sumer because they're Indian, and the sort of what we did find in, I think it was 2011, in the, caves in the Zagros Mountains, is a sort of Neolithic depiction of a buzzard on the top of a stick, and we have similar things at the edge of the Paleolithic to the Neolithic that are found in Navali Chori and the kind of area in and around eastern Turkey, where you have the same shape of a bird on a stick, essentially, that is older than Sumeria, and it just kind of brings it. It's another piece that adds to that whole. Hang on, something is the shape. Even if there was it's very difficult to make the historical claim that that particular sort of religious shape survived unmolested from the Neolithic to now. But if it didn't, that same shape was restored millennia later in the same part of the world, and then you kind of you squint at that and go, wait a minute.
Well, yeah. I mean, the whole bird, especially the buzzard concept, you find these depictions of birds and birdmen, at, I think, Mohenjo-Daro, if I'm not mistaken, and maybe at Göbekli Tepe. I've forgotten exactly. I'm getting my chronologies mixed up. But this idea of bird-like creatures, kind of menacing bird-like creatures, is everywhere there in these, as you say, in these Paleolithic drawings. And then in India itself, you have, as part of their sacred objects, you have a bird on a stick, which is, something that they carry around in processions and everything else. And the Yazidi have it almost identically. An identical kind of emblem, and I thought, wow, this is either they're from India or they're both talking about the same thing.
Well, you have in southern India a god form riding a peacock that has the sort of 7 eyes of the feathers, which, as the sort of head of a procession, I think there's some astrotheology there. I think you're sort of looking at a depiction of the Pleiades, and if you kind of decolonize how we view the rise of Vedic culture in the subcontinent, you sort of land on the idea that there's clearly a blending and swapping of culture and ideas that is happening, and you just kind of look back at some of the Yazidi claims of antiquity and go, you know what, I'm not taking that off the table. There's right. Too many pieces that allow you to go, sure, why not? I mean, each archaeological season seems to bring something that has a typological map to some part of that kind of mythology.
And I think, just since you brought it up, we have a second. I just want to give a good plug to Starships, by the way, which I haven't been able to tell you in the last our last podcast. But people should read Starships. I mean, it covers a lot of ground. but it does so in a sort of in an intelligent, calm way, just not like psychotically screaming. So something like this is a very valuable addition to a library. People who are interested in this subject should definitely be reading Starships. I just wanted to put that in there because
you heard
it's
it from
true.
Peter Levenda. I'm just gonna
there you go.
put that out there, everyone listening. Well, speaking of books, that should neatly bring us up to the Lovecraft Code. I heard you talk about it on Jimmy Church, and that was my reminder to go. Okay, I think it was Jimmy Church. Doesn't matter. I've got to reach out and go. We spoke about this via email earlier in the year, and it sounded kind of exciting. And then there are parts of it that tie in with Florida 20th century history and Lovecraft's connections to it that I think is worth exploring. So, Mr. Levenda, the Lovecraft Code and its sort of formation.
Yeah, well, the Lovecraft Code began years ago. I've been trying to sell this novel for years and years, and every time I've had to change it and update it and fix it. And finally, the people who published The Dark Lord decided, we'll take a chance. We've never done a novel before, but let's try this one. The reason is the Lovecraft Code is based at, I would say 50% of what you read in the Lovecraft Code is factually accurate, in the sense that I'm really basing a novel on actual events, and I'm tying these events together in a narrative. And you're absolutely right. There's a large segment of the book that deals with Florida in the 20th century, and the fact that Lovecraft himself visited Florida on a number of occasions, especially down to Key West, but also to different parts of Florida. Robert Barlow was a friend of his, a young guy. I mean, I think he was still a high school student when he made contact with Lovecraft.
To interrupt, I think this is one of the shoes that is remaining to be dropped in the life of H.P. Lovecraft. I think that's highly aberrant behavior for a 40-something-year-old man to go and visit a high school student repeated times.
Yes, and in my novel, you'll be grateful to learn that I did not go there. but there was something. That's a shoe waiting to be dropped for sure. And then Barlow's history after that puts the icing on the cake. I mean,
I think so.
Here's Robert Barlow, a very young guy but brilliant, right? A brilliant scholar who becomes Lovecraft's literary executor after Lovecraft dies. He's in charge of all of Lovecraft's writings, whatever he can find, a lot of which he gives to Brown University for safekeeping. Other bits and pieces don't quite make it to Brown. And then he becomes an expert in Mexican ethnography and in languages like Nahuatl and some of the other Mexican dialects. He's giving lectures on this at the University of Mexico. William Burroughs is one of his students. You can't make this stuff up. And on New Year's Eve, Robert Barlow commits suicide. And Burroughs sees the body and writes about it. And later that same year, Burroughs would kill his own wife with this, this accidental thing of putting the apple on her head, and shooting it with his rifle and basically killing her. So you have this confluence of weird events there. I mean, that is enough to work with right there, But who else, is in Key West at exactly the same time that Lovecraft is in Key West, the same month and year and everything else? There's a bizarre German gentleman who's living in Key West who has a very strange background, a very strange backstory, most of which we know is probably nonsense, but another portion of it is obviously true. Here's a German who was very involved in occultism, involved with the Rosicrucian Society, actually had his articles published in a Rosicrucian magazine, the one put out by Amorc in California. Here's a guy who claims to be a medical doctor, and he's not actually. He gets a job as an X-ray technician at the U.S. Marine Hospital in Key West. So he's working for the government, in a sense, our government. He was a prisoner of war during World War I. He was in Germany in the 1920s at the time that, during the Beer Hall Putsch, and at the time when Hitler was coming to power. He was kind of a right-wing kind of guy. He was kind of a pro-fascist type. He came from a sort of landed family, according to him. There was some money there. There was all of this. But for whatever reason, he winds up in Key West, Florida. in the same era that Lovecraft is going and traveling to Key West. I don't have any evidence or any proof at all that these two gentlemen ever met. Okay, so we put that on the table right away. But they were in the same town at the same time. What's so important is that this German guy tried to resuscitate a corpse and spent a considerable fortune trying to do it, built an elaborate mausoleum with all sorts of additional features to enable him to go there in the middle of the night and keep changing the fluids that were going into this woman's body. She was a woman, a Cuban woman he fell in love with, madly in love, claimed he had seen her in dreams and in visions back in Europe and in India and everywhere else. And now he was determined he was going to bring her back to life, and the only way to do that was to keep the body viable in some way. So he's pumping nutrients into this body. I mean, it's so macabre, and yet it's absolutely 100% documented and real. At some point, his family, the girl's family, finds out. He gets arrested. He's thrown in jail. Nothing they can do. Statute of limitations ran out. He stole a body from the graveyard, but that's not really a serious crime. And so he's let out. He gets all sorts of offers of marriage from women who thought it's the most romantic thing they'd ever heard. And anyway, he continues this obsession with this woman to the end of his days. He wants to reanimate a corpse. And in the couple of years before he started this process, Lovecraft was writing that series of stories, Herbert West Reanimator, about reanimating a corpse. So here's the guy who thinks of reanimation down in Key West, Florida. I mean, you can't imagine Lovecraft in Key West. I just don't put that together. But there's Lovecraft in Key West, right? And he's hanging out there. He wanted to take a ferry to Cuba. He didn't have enough money for the ferry, so he went back home. But he's down there in Key West at the same time that Carl von Tassel is down there doing his experiments and trying to keep this girl alive. It's just the juxtaposition of these two is just delicious, and you can't really, get away from it. And at the same time, Lovecraft also was visiting someone else called Whitehead, who was a minister of some kind, who specialized in writing about voodoo, and Afro-Caribbean religions. And he was someone who had spent a lot of time in the Caribbean, in places like Haiti and Jamaica, and he was doing a study of all of these groups. And now he's kind of a minister, and he has boy groups, young boys that he's mentoring, and he takes them all camping, and then he has Lovecraft down to give little lectures and speeches to these groups of young boys. This is the same time when Lovecraft is visiting Robert Barlow, who's also a young boy.
Yeah.
That's the other shoe.
Yeah, that is definitely the other shoe. And for people who don't know, Barlow's father built a kind of shack for this creepy 40-something-year-old man to come and visit his teenage son. So there's a shoe to drop in Florida. Let's put it that way.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Or a flip-flop or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this comes into the story as well, into the Lovecraft Code. But the main thrust of the novel is juxtaposing Lovecraft's story, Call of Cthulhu, and the characters in that story. A Professor George Angel of Brown University, who's a professor of Asian Oriental languages, as they called it then. And he comes across the Cthulhu cult, of course, and it's in his papers that the evidence of the Cthulhu cult is discovered. And so I take that family, the Angel family of the 1920s, and I really give a lot more backstory on George Angel as an archaeologist and as someone involved with Asian religions. I have him out in Turkey and in Syria visiting the Yazidi and that sort of thing, giving some backstory and some fleshing out of who he would have been. And then I connected to the actual Angel family, the present-day Angel family of Providence, Rhode Island. There's a street called Angel. Lovecraft lived on Angel Street. It's named after a very ancient, Providence family going back hundreds of years. And there's a contemporary Angel, which was my connection to the whole story. It ignited this idea. And that is there's David Angel. And a lot of people don't know who that is. But David Angel was one of the writers and producers for television shows like Cheers and Wings and Frasier. David Angel was a major player in those television series. And he and his wife died on September 11th, 2001, when their plane crashed into the North Tower. So I have my protagonist, another professor, Gregory Angel, who's a professor of religious studies, living in Brooklyn and watching the planes attack the towers, not knowing that one of his estranged relatives basically was on that flight, and then putting two together, and then volunteering to assist the war effort in Afghanistan and Iraq, and becoming embedded in the military as an expert in languages, Arabic, Urdu, Pashto, and that sort of thing, and then having an experience in Mosul of a conflict between Yazidi and Muslims, which basically turns him into an atheist. And he's lost his religion, he's lost his way, he's lost his path. And then he's sort of recruited by an agency of the US government to go back into the Middle East. And it has to do with the Cthulhu cult. And that's about all I'm going to give you on that one. But that's where the story is. It's present day, more or less present day. 2014 is when all this is taking place. I have a sequel that I'm writing, which will bring it up to date to the contemporary times, and then a book after that. I'm visioning this as a trilogy. But right now I'm looking at, what would the cult of Cthulhu really look like today? What's its relationship to ideas like, the ancient aliens and all the rest of it? Everything that's gone on since Lovecraft died. Let's look at it from a different point of view and sort of put some new flesh and blood on this and see what it would look like. And would it get violent? And, what groups, what cults around the world may be influenced by something like this today and this kind of ideology. So that's really behind the Lovecraft Code. It's a fictional way of telling something that I think is true on some level.
Well, we were talking before the show that because, as is inevitable with most novels, it's several years in gestation, and it kind of falls back into that odd Call of Cthulhu sync where the world started to conform with the fiction that was being written to such a way that you've had to, over the last couple of years, update it because of a sequence of I actually can't believe this happened events, particularly to do with geopolitics in the Middle East.
Certainly. I mean, especially to do with Iraq and Mosul. When I started writing this about Mosul, the city of Mosul, there was no Islamic State, didn't exist, right? It hadn't existed yet. I mean, there was, there's Al Qaeda, and there was, what was happening in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, it was against the backdrop of September 11th, but that was it. As things progressed, and as suddenly Mosul fell, and which meant that Nineveh fell, and Nimrod fell, and all these other cities fell, and all this is going on, and suddenly we're hearing about the Yazidis every single day, and the fact that they're being surrounded by the Islamic State, and there's genocide, and women are being captured and sold as sex slaves. All this stuff about the Yazidi, no one had heard about the Yazidi except a handful of us, before 2001.
So you
really before.
Yeah. So you write a book that is, what would a death cult bent on destroying the world be doing today?
Exactly, and that's what happened. I mean, then it's happening in front of me, and I'm thinking, oh, what am I going to do? I mean, this is fact following fiction. I mean, I was flabbergasted when I started reading about Mosul every day. And the Islamic State making that their headquarters basically in Iraq. I'm thinking, what? And then of course the Yazidis falling, and the genocide that was taking place, the attack on their sacred mountain, the Kurdish forces, the Peshmerga, and all of this. None of this was really happening yet. When I started writing Lovecraft Code, and then it all started happening. It was just following the narrative. So I had to get out in front of it a little bit. And I did the best I could, and I had the feeling that when this book hits on December 1st, it's going to be old news already. So, but at least it'll be a way of looking at it from a kind of a creative point of view. Let's see what this is really all about, because many of us don't know what this is all about. Let's face it. We hear about Daesh, we hear about the Islamic State, we hear about all these things. We have all kinds of spin on these stories. There's all kinds of cover-ups that take place and bad information coming out. And I'm saying, let's just step back a little bit and look at this from a sort of geopolitical point of view, or a cosmic point of view, maybe, and see what does this all really mean? What's really going on here on a deeper level? Because this is not really about Islam anymore. This is about something else. So that's the approach of Lovecraft Code. I'm just penetrating this a little bit and trying to trying to understand it.
Well,
And doing it in a way that I hope is entertaining, and people will, learn something in spite of themselves, about it.
Well, funnily enough, one of the questions toward the end of my list of questions here is, what is the value of the Cthulhu mythos for, contemporary metaphysicians? And one of the sort of notes I've written to myself is, part of it is it sort of provides an almost off-the-shelf intellectual position that allows us to look again or frame how little we know about, the forces in question, and how little we know about other ages and cultures and how they engage with them. And it was interesting that was one of my questions, because you said the book allows us to think at an angle at something like the rise of ancient aliens theory and so on.
Yeah, and I think that's not just. I've come across something in the last couple of months in particular. I've been kind of forced onto Facebook, screaming and yelling, because I'm involved in another project, the Secret Machines project with Tom DeLonge. And, the social media is part of the branding and marketing platform for all of this. So I've gone onto it. And, I get inquiries from people, and people say things or they claim things. And I realize that how little people really understand about occultism. What is occultism? They jump to all sorts of conclusions. They hear the word occult and they think they know what it is. And they really don't. In fact, there's many occultists who really don't. So it's one of these things where I found myself having to explain and over-explain and re-explain ideas about occultism. And, Lovecraft is a perfect way of getting into that. His Cthulhu mythos is one way of understanding what occultism is, what kind of forces are involved. I mean, he's very overly dramatic, and, he's extreme about a lot of it. But at the same time, there's something you can sink your teeth into with that. And I find that it is relevant to the other project I'm working on with DeLonge, the Secret Machines project, which is an examination of the UFO phenomenon, but from a completely different perspective, at an angle, as you say. And there's a crossover, between the novel and between Secret Machines, the nonfiction books that I'm working on with Tom, and, the people that we talk to. I mean, some of the people that we talk to, some of the experts in their various fields will kind of loosen up a little bit and talk about this phenomenon in ways that are uncannily similar to the way that, Lovecraft would have framed the same information. We're talking about forces that cannot be seen, that cannot be predicted. We're talking about technology, but really, is it technology the way we understand that term? For us, technology is a very materialistic thing. It comes from the word techne, which means a tool. I mean, are these tools, or is this a way of being? Is it a way of living? Are our bodies machines? Are our bodies tools, in a very sort of Westworld kind of approach? What is really going on? And Lovecraft provides one way of looking at it. He kind of divides the world into us versus them. And it's not a question of angels versus demons, in a Dan Brown kind of way. It's more like Alien versus Predator,
Yeah.
We're not sure if there's an ethical or moral equivalence behind these forces. And I think as long as we think there is, we're living in kind of a fool's paradise. What we have to do is look at this from a purely objective point of view and think to ourselves, in terms of our own survival, how do we approach this material? And do we have one hand tied behind our back because we're not accepting the possibilities inherent in the ancient aliens narrative, for instance, or the Lovecraftian narrative, or the UFO phenomenon narrative? Are we missing something important? And I think that's what we're doing with the Secret Machines project. We're trying to get there. We're trying to reframe all of this in a different way so that people can look at this and think differently about it, because we're kind of in a box with a lot of this material. We think we understand what occultism is. We think we understand what Satanism is. We think we understand what UFOs are, and magic and Crowley and chaos magic and starships. We think we know what all that means, and and I know we don't. Or when I say we, general public doesn't. And we may have a bit more of an angle on it, And if they would only take a breath, and try to understand what all this is, they would understand that they need to know more. and they need to change their perspective.
Well, that's where I think, because if you, from a sort of contemporary or practicing metaphysician perspective, there's not a lot of long-term value in kind of creating a religion around some of the fictional characters, like in Lovecraft, right? For the old ones and so on.
Sure.
What you do get is a intellectual position, particularly for, say, Anglo-Americans on over a long enough period, foreign soil. In the experience and perspective of a kind of classic Lovecraftian protagonist, you do get to start thinking about the cosmos without that moral frame that you were just mentioning. That one of the things, and we can all argue about how good a writer he was. Lovecraft was very good at depicting the amorality of these forces, which is, I actually think, a better intellectual position to begin analyzing them, so that you don't fall into these ones are the good ones and I'll put them over here, and these ones are the bad ones and I'll put them over here. You have a much more naturalistic, almost ecosystemic view that these things don't conform to the box you just mentioned. And that, for me, that's always been the kind of value of the quote-unquote Cthulhu mythos, is that it, even though it's a dramatization, a classic Lovecraftian protagonist allows you to analyze these phenomena with not a completely blank slate, but a slate with less stuff on it.
Sure. And you're perfectly correct from my point of view in talking about these forces as amoral or just not, identifiable from a position of morality, because that's what gets us into trouble, right? Then my religion is better than yours, right? I mean, it gets into this whole division scenario when you start making those distinctions, and you're all wrong. Basically, we're all wrong. We're all dealing with, bad information or with a deck of cards missing a few trumps. So we're in the position where we don't really know what we're talking about, but we feel we do, and we're insisting on our position because we're frightened. We're frightened of that amorality. Lovecraft was frightened by it, but he sort of grappled with it head on. He was saying these forces are amoral. And I think that in other cultures, and as you know, I've traveled around a lot. I've lived in countries overseas. I've been in Southeast Asia for a long time. The idea of morality, the way we understand it, is just not there when talking about spiritual forces. They can be on our side or not. They can coexist with the mainstream religions, in a way that you can be pious in a mainstream way and it still still perform rituals for the other gods, because that's just the wise thing to do, because they are forces and you don't want to piss them off.
Well,
that's true in Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, places like that I've been.
Well, so I was on Skeptico the other week, and we had this discussion similarly, because anyway, it was about whether morality is something inherent in the universe, and I don't think it is, which, funnily enough, is why I think it falls to humans to behave in a moralistic way, or otherwise it's nowhere. But that's not really the point I'm going with. I mentioned that, so one of the more famous over the last 20 years researchers into animism, Graham Harvey, in his study of Maori mythology and Maori cultural practices, they would... one of the goals of kind of ritual was to acquire the amorality of these beings when you would go into the into the woods or out to sea to hunt or to fish, because the amorality of these beings is what is required to hunt, because you have to be able to kill with impunity. And it's, I think, in cultures that have a much more nuanced understanding. Like, funny enough, we get the word amorality wrong. People listening to this will think amorality is behaving with bad morals. It's behaving without morality. That's literally right. What the A is. And if you look at some of the examples going back to sort of Obeah and Wanga, where the reason, say, the Loa have the powers they do to interact with the world is that they performed a favor for the creator, and the creator asked them, what do you want, as payment for this? And they said, we want to be able to do whatever we want. And so we have different cultures that I think, in fact, we're in the minority, realistically. Other cultures have a much more nuanced awareness that you're dealing with stuff that doesn't conform to getting a gold star at the end of the school day or so on.
Right, and I think that in our culture, what we're not aware of, unless you actually confront it personally on a personal level, is the fact that many of the most powerful people in our cultures are amoral, and they disguise it. They disguise that fact. They give lip service to morality or to, organized religion or something. But to get to a level of the kind of power that we're talking about, the power on the law level, they have to be, let's say, 90% amoral, then, if we don't want to consider them completely amoral. But there's a very laissez-faire attitude, a very cavalier attitude towards morality on the part of those people. And they act in that way. They behave in that fashion. And yet at the same time, they try to convince us that they are among the most moral because that's the only way they would survive in the first place, but also to keep us from becoming powerful. It's important for us to be moral and for them to be amoral. That's the edge they have over us, in a sense. I mean, there's a lot of television programming that's been kind of teasing along the edges of that concept. Who is moral and who isn't, and is it moral to do this? If it means that these people are going to die, or do you do what you have to do to preserve life, even though you're doing it in a way that would be considered totally amoral? Where do we draw the line?
No, absolutely, and this is a Lovecraftian warning. I think people would go insane if they actually connected these dots, which is exactly how Lovecraft opened it. It's like if you actually kind of got what the science and the culture and in our case the exploration of psi phenomena kind of meant plugged in together, you would be as scared as my protagonists.
Sure.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And that, funnily enough, is a journey we kind of have to go on so that we end up with a moral position ourselves, because I don't think it is reflected back very often in how the universe behaves, and it kind of I land in that kind of classical philosophical perspective on it, which is the morality has to come from us, or otherwise it doesn't exist in the universe.
Exactly, and I think that's probably what our main contribution is going to be to this whole rodeo, is the morality factor, which is something we've invented, which, as you say, does not exist in the universe. I don't see it in the universe anywhere. So we've kind of invented this, and this may be what our value is in this universe, in this cosmos, or it may be, it may be a booby trap. I don't know, but the idea is that we've done something different. We're saying there is a right and a wrong, that there is right and wrong behavior. Karl Marx famously wrote an essay called Die Judenfrage, right, the Jewish question, and people don't realize that Marx was kind of a self-hating Jew, and he wrote very mean things about Jews. And one of the things that he was saying in this essay was that it was the Jews who had created the idea of human rights, in order to protect themselves. Like, they created this idea that all humans have rights and you shouldn't, bother them. And that was like this nefarious, cynical thing that they invented so that people wouldn't kill them. Since all humans have rights and all humans should be valued and life should be valued, therefore you can't kill us either. was Karl Marx's point of view. And in a strange way, what we're saying now in this conversation is that we've created morality maybe for that reason, so we don't really kill each other, that we don't destroy each other and maybe in the process destroy the planet, destroy life itself. Maybe we feel that we have to, since we don't understand the forces, we don't understand how to manipulate them, and that may be a good thing. What we have to do is have a set of arbitrary laws that we follow, a little bit like Moreau in the H.G. Wells story about the island of Dr. Moreau, where his creatures have to learn to walk on 2 feet and say, "Are we not men?" That was their moral code. I mean, it's something that was instilled from outside. They were told, these creatures that Dr. Moreau had created out of amalgams of humans and animals, they had no religion, they had no faith, they had no moral structure. So he imposed it by force, and he made them think that any dereliction of duty where this was concerned was punishable by something severe. So that's how morality was being instilled in these creatures. And so we're all standing there saying, "Are we not men?" Maybe not. No. Maybe not.
Yeah.
But let's just assume that we are for the sake of argument and just so that we can all stay alive a little bit longer.
And this absolutely is the value. Funnily enough, as you said, growing up, horror fiction didn't particularly interest you, and you've gone on to write, a Lovecraftian horror fiction book.
Yeah,
this is the value of it in that sort of Aristotelian view of what tragedy and comedy are for on the stage. It's a space for the psychological exploration of these ideas. It's a way of kind of having those discussions, and this is like what Lovecraft and it was because he was probably insane and he was definitely a racist and all this stuff. We'll just call him flawed. You end up with a very a very stripped down version of that. Like, his horror is horrifying. It's horrifying when you stop and think about it, and I think it's in the kind of classical theatrical sense that this is what fiction is for. It's to make a space that we can resonate or explore with these ideas. Is where we find value in Lovecraft. Yeah,
I agree wholeheartedly.
Well, funnily enough, I was thinking about this just before we hit the record button. To be fair, I don't know a lot about Florida fiction. Why? It doesn't appear that Florida has a Gothic, though, which is odd, if you look at some of its neighbors to the west. Why is that? I mean, I know you're very interested in place. It's one of the things I resonate with your work. I mean, is this Florida fiction, and is there a kind of Gothic waiting to be explored in Florida?
Interesting you should bring that up. There is a new television series that's going to be coming out on one of the cable channels, and the title of it is Truth is Stranger Than Florida. And that's the name. And it's an entire series based upon, Florida and, famous murder cases and things of that nature taking place in Florida. Weird scenes inside the gold mine, in Florida. So all of this is because there have been layers and levels of different groups that have been to Florida and claimed it as their own. There's, an ancient Native American culture there. There's actually burial mounds in Florida that far south, which I find, bizarre. There's, of course, the influx of people from the Caribbean. So you have that. You have a lot of Haitians, of course, here. You have a lot of Cubans, naturally, in Florida. That's another layer. Then you had all of the snowbirds, coming in from the north, New York and New Jersey, retiring in Florida. You had, cocaine towers, the Colombian influence and all the money that came into Florida. You have it's more of a 20th century than it is 21st or 19th century, thing. I think you can start it with Lovecraft coming down and, our famous German Bizarro guy with his reanimation efforts. There is a kind of a Gothic aspect to Florida. It's just that Florida being tropical, the whole thing lacks a certain je ne sais quoi, I mean, it's all plantation stuff. It's moss growing, and it's a kind of a southern Florida, the people who've always been in Florida who sort of resent everyone else coming in. And then there are the new people who show up, and there's this conflict, this tension between these groups. So the Northerners build these little enclaves for themselves, and there's all these weird retirement communities, everywhere. And then you go up to St. Augustine, and it's all different again. The oldest city in North America being St. Augustine. So you have, that kind of strange vibe that's taking place there. And of course you have the Scientology up near in Clearwater on the other side of the state. Their headquarters is there. You have strange stuff going on in Florida for sure. But I don't think my novel is Florida fiction necessarily. It's not like Elmore Leonard or something like that, who's really was writing about, southern U.S. kind of milieu. I don't really dwell on that too much. Most of the writing of Lovecraft Code is either in New England with Lovecraft up there, or Key West, as I mentioned. But a lot of it is outside. It's in New York, or it's in the Middle East, quite frankly, all the way out into China. So
yeah, sure. I think you nailed it with because I'm trying to work out why And I think it's a 19th century, 20th century difference, although things have obviously historically happened to Florida prior to the 20th century, quite a number of them. Sure. The more classic Southern Gothic does rely on crumbling plantation homes and family secrets and this sort of fallout of the 19th century and all Florida's like the big Florida things you mentioned, migration patterns and drugs and so on, are very 20th century. So maybe we wait another 100 years and Florida gets its own, I don't know, Anne Rice,
Well, the funny thing is, a couple of months ago, I was interviewed on film for a production company in Florida that's doing a show on Florida, just specifically on the weird stuff, in Florida. And to prepare for that, I went through all my notes and everything else. And, we started talking about Operation Mongoose. The largest CIA, station in the world was in Florida, in Miami, at the University of Miami. We were talking about, assassinations and things like that being plotted in Florida, talking about the famous Supreme Court case that allowed worshippers of Santeria to sacrifice animals. There was a lot of strange stuff happened in Florida.
Yeah, that's what I don't get, right?
It's not Gothic yet.
Yeah.
It's not quite. It hasn't reached the Gothic. I mean, during the Gothic period, if we want to call it that, Florida was virtually uninhabited. I mean, there were a lot of small towns and stuff around the Everglades, but Miami per se was nothing. I mean, it took a lot of entrepreneurs to come down and turn South Beach into what it is, and Miami Beach and all of that. But wow, until about the beginning of the 20th century, there was nothing down here.
Yeah.
Most of the houses I've been to, most of the buildings I've seen are all dating from 40, 50, 60 years ago at the most, So you don't really find old ancient homes and that sort of thing in Florida, except, St. Augustine and its fort and all that sort of thing. But other than that, you don't find much that's very old here.
That'll
and you need old to get Gothic.
You do. The nature reclaims the built environment in Florida in a very different way to it reclaiming the built environment in New England. So we'll see how that goes. It's more likely to collapse into the ocean rather than have ivy. Have ivy growing all over it. But that's why it surprised me that because Florida is so weird, spelt with a Y, that there hasn't. It hasn't happened quite yet. Well, let's put it this way. It hasn't reached Australia. Like, weird Florida fiction hasn't reached Australia. And it seems like a place where that kind of thing could happen. So there we go.
Well, I'm in Fort Lauderdale, and it hasn't reached me either.
Well, Peter, as ever, this has been an absolutely fantastic chat. And we will have linked up where people can find the Lovecraft Code. But you did mention... through gritted teeth, your social media presence. So if people who are keen to find out more or engage, where else would they go to do so?
Well, of course, I have a website, peterlevenda.com, but also I'm on Facebook, and I'm on Twitter, God help me, and I'm on Instagram for my sins. So they can find me in all of those places.
Nice one. They will be linked. And again, thank you very much. I'm very much looking forward to the book.
Thank you very much for having me on. Great talking to you.
There you have it. Unmercifully correlating the contents of this podcast, we have Lovecraft's inspiration, his impact, some of his impending shoe drops, the Yazidi, the curious way fact follows fiction follows fact, the morality of the universe, and, because I always wanted to know, weird Florida. For more of this sort of goodness, subscribe to the show in iTunes, in your favorite podcatcher, or on YouTube. Let me know what you think at runesoup.com or the Rune Soup Facebook page, and find me on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.